Every year, billions of dollars flow into U.S. elections, but most voters have no idea where the money comes from or how it shapes the outcome. In the 2020 election alone, more than $14 billion was spent across the nation, more than double what was spent just a decade ago. But here's the shocking part: less than 1% of Americans are responsible for almost half of that spending. So, who really controls our elections? And why is the system rigged to favor the rich and powerful? In this video, we're diving into the hidden world of campaign finance and revealing how money in politics isn't just about funding campaigns. It's about buying influence, shaping policies, and making sure the rich stay in control. We'll uncover how billionaires and corporations have taken over the political process, leaving everyday voters with little power. Stay tuned to discover how the system works, why it's broken, and what we can do to fix it. The truth might just surprise you. Chapter 1: The Hidden Money Flow. Who's really funding elections? Campaign finance is far more than just individual contributions. It's a hidden world of big money, where corporate giants and wealthy individuals have the power to tilt elections in their favor. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, in the 2020 election cycle, a staggering $14 billion was spent on federal elections alone. The bulk of this money didn't come from the average voter, but from super PACs, dark money groups, and corporate interests. Super PACs, or political action committees, can raise unlimited amounts of money from individuals, unions, and corporations. Their only restriction? They can't coordinate directly with the candidates they support. But don't be fooled, indirect influence is where the real power lies. These PACs can flood the airwaves with ads, shape public opinion, and play a massive role in determining the outcome of an election. The term, dark money, refers to funds spent by organizations that don't have to disclose their donors. In 2020, dark money groups spent around $1 billion, much of it shrouded in secrecy. It's like trying to play a game of Monopoly, but not knowing who owns Boardwalk. This lack of transparency makes it impossible for voters to know who's pulling the strings behind their favorite candidates. But where does this money actually go? It's not just TV ads. Big money donors fund everything from research on political messaging to organizing rallies. According to a report from Open Secrets, in the 2020 election, nearly $500 million was spent on digital ads alone. That's a massive shift from traditional media, and it's a game changer for how campaigns operate today. For candidates, securing these funds is a full-time job. Fundraising takes up a significant chunk of their time, often more than actual policy making. This means that the voices of everyday voters can be drowned out by the money of a few, creating a system where the wealthy have the loudest voices. In fact, studies show that just 1% of Americans contribute to about 70% of the total election spending. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on how the system works and why it's so broken. Chapter 2: The Power of the Few. How billionaires buy influence. The power of the wealthy in politics is undeniable. In the 2016 election cycle, the top 100 individual donors gave more than $1 billion, about 30% of the total spending for that election. This concentrated power is so significant that it's often called the plutocracy, a system where a small group of wealthy elites controls the majority of the power. Billionaires like Charles and David Koch, who together have funneled hundreds of millions into conservative causes, have had a profound impact on the political landscape. Their wealth allows them to influence elections at every level, from local school board races to the presidency. In 2016 alone, the Koch network spent over $400 million to support conservative candidates and causes. But it's not just conservative billionaires. Liberal donors like George Soros have similarly poured massive amounts of money into political causes. Soros spent an estimated $30 million in support of progressive candidates and policies in the 2016 cycle, and his influence extends across multiple elections. The reason billionaires can play such a dominant role is simple: money buys access. Politicians spend hours courting big donors, attending lavish fundraisers, and giving private speeches. In return, these donors expect something, whether it's tax breaks, deregulation, or favorable policies. According to the Washington Post, 40% of all political donations come from just 0.01% of the population. Perhaps one of the most eye-opening examples of this influence is the rise of the billionaire-backed candidate. In 2020, Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, spent over $1 billion of his own money running for president. Bloomberg didn't win, but his campaign demonstrated just how far personal wealth can go in shaping the race. With his enormous war chest, he dominated airwaves and TV screens, outspending rivals by a margin that was almost impossible to overcome. Chapter 3: Loopholes and Legislation. The laws that let it happen. The current campaign finance system is full of loopholes that allow money to flood in from all directions. One of the most significant moments in modern campaign finance law was the Supreme Court's 2010 Citizens United vs. FEC decision. This ruling effectively removed limits on how much money corporations and unions can spend to influence elections. In essence, the court decided that money is a form of free speech. The results were immediate and dramatic. As soon as Citizens United was handed down, super PACs began to proliferate, and election spending skyrocketed. In the 2012 election, super PACs spent nearly $1 billion, more than double what they had in 2008. But Citizens United didn't create this system overnight. Long before this ruling, the campaign finance system was already riddled with loopholes. Take, for example, the way politicians fundraise. Candidates can legally accept donations from PACs, corporations, and individuals. However, they're supposed to disclose these donations. In reality, many of these disclosures are vague or delayed, allowing donors to conceal their contributions until after the election is over. Another tactic used by wealthy donors is bundling. This is when an individual collects donations from others and presents them to a candidate as a single large donation. While bundling is legal, it allows donors to give far beyond the legal limits, often with little oversight. A single bundler can raise millions of dollars for a candidate, making him virtually untouchable. And then there's the issue of dark money, funds funneled through non-profit groups that don't have to disclose their donors. These groups can spend unlimited amounts of money on ads, voter outreach, and other activities without revealing who's behind them. This lack of transparency means that voters often have no idea who is truly influencing their vote. In 2020, dark money groups spent more than $1 billion, accounting for almost 40% of all outside spending in federal elections. This massive influx of untraceable funds has led some to argue that the current system is fundamentally broken. Even though there are laws meant to curb the influence of big money, the reality is that loopholes and LAX enforcement mean that the rich and powerful still dominate the system. Subscribe now to get more insights on how money is shaping politics and why we need change. Chapter 4: The Rigged Game. Why small donors are left out. In the current campaign finance system, small donors are increasingly becoming an afterthought. The reality is that big donors have more influence than ever. A single donor's contribution of $10 million can have a much larger impact than the combined donations of hundreds of thousands of average citizens. In fact, just 0.01% of Americans are responsible for about 40% of all campaign donations. For the rest of us, it often feels like our voices get drowned out. This inequality is most apparent when you look at the actual spending in campaigns. According to Open Secrets, during the 2020 presidential election, more than 70% of campaign funds came from large donors, not small individuals. A large portion of these funds went toward expensive advertising campaigns, which small donors simply can't compete with. Moreover, small donors often feel disconnected from the political process because their contributions don't yield the same level of access or influence. Wealthy individuals are invited to private fundraisers, where they can speak directly with candidates, while the average donor might only get a generic thank you email. As a result, candidates tend to listen to their largest donors first, leaving everyday citizens feeling ignored. The disparity in campaign spending is so stark that some argue it creates a rigged game, where only the wealthy have a seat at the table. For example, during the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump each raised billions of dollars for their campaigns, while many smaller candidates struggled to get by with a fraction of that amount. It's not just about money, it's about how that money can influence policy decisions. Chapter 5: How Campaign Finance Corrupts Policy and Democracy. The biggest issue with today's campaign finance system isn't just that it's broken, it's that it actively corrupts policy and democracy. Money in politics doesn't just buy influence, it shapes the policies that affect all of us. When politicians are heavily reliant on big money donors, they are incentivized to craft policies that benefit their financial backers, not the general public. A key example of this is the relationship between the fossil fuel industry and the US government. According to a 2019 report by the Center for Responsive Politics, the oil and gas industry spent over $100 million on lobbying in 2018 alone. This money buys access to lawmakers, ensuring that policies beneficial to these industries, like LAX environmental regulations, remain in place. In turn, these policies contribute to the worsening climate crisis while lining the pockets of the industry's wealthiest players. It's not just environmental policies that are affected. The healthcare industry, for instance, spends millions to shape legislation in its favor. A ProPublica investigation found that the health insurance industry spent over $400 million in lobbying expenses in 2018, influencing key healthcare policies, including the Affordable Care Act. This ensures that big healthcare companies continue to thrive, while ordinary citizens struggle with rising premiums and out-of-pocket costs. The influence of money in politics doesn't stop at policy, it also undermines trust in the democratic process itself. When the public sees that elections are largely funded by wealthy elites, it creates a sense of disillusionment. A Pew Research Center poll found that 85% of Americans believe that money has too much influence in elections, and a majority believe that political donations affect how lawmakers vote on issues. Chapter 6: Breaking the System. What can be done? Despite the overwhelming influence of money in politics, there are ways to break the system and restore power to ordinary citizens. The first step toward reform is to introduce stricter transparency laws. One idea gaining traction is the Disclose Act, which would require all political spending to be reported in real time. This would force dark money groups to reveal their donors, giving voters the information they need to make informed decisions. Another potential solution is public financing of elections. In places like Maine and Arizona, politicians can choose to fund their campaigns through small contributions from the public, rather than relying on large donors. These clean elections programs have proven successful at reducing the influence of big money donors and increasing the participation of ordinary citizens. According to the National Institute on Money in Politics, candidates who use public financing often report higher levels of voter support because they are not beholden to wealthy donors. One interesting proposal is to implement a small donor matching system, where small donations from individuals are matched with public funds. This would make it easier for candidates who rely on grassroots support to compete against wealthier opponents. In New York City, a program like this has already been implemented, matching small donations at a ratio of 6-to-1. This has allowed candidates with less fundraising power to run competitive campaigns. Reforms aren't just limited to the federal level. Local elections are also key to reforming campaign finance. In recent years, several cities have implemented their own laws to limit campaign contributions and promote transparency. For example, Seattle introduced a public financing program for city council elections, helping to level the playing field for smaller candidates. Finally, one of the most effective ways to combat the influence of money in politics is by engaging voters in the reform process. Grassroots movements, like those led by organizations such as Common Cause and Represent Us, are working to raise awareness about campaign finance issues. These groups push for reforms at both the state and federal levels, aiming to reduce the influence of big money and make the system more democratic. Subscribe and stay tuned to learn more about the fight for a fairer, more transparent political system.